you, Anna. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so meet the locals. Thank you very much. Sorry, just now the theme of my talk this morning has already been picked up by several of the previous speakers, and what I want to begin with is a consideration of the way in which we write the history of the archaeology of Cyprus, and indeed the history of archaeology right throughout the Mediterranean world. As you know, there are two big approaches that have dominated the tradition of writing history. Firstly, of course, there is a very long tradition going back almost to the beginnings of scientific archaeology itself, of narrating the excavations and intellectual interpretations of archaeological finds. And this is often quite progressivist in the sense that it seeks to show the development of archaeology from a search for hidden treasure and casual excavation down to a modern multidisciplinary subject that we have today. Secondly, of course, in more recent times, we've realized the imperial, colonial and political background to a lot of archaeological activity and interpretation. And this, of course, is very relevant today in the broader political discussions and debates about the legacy of imperialism, particularly racism and ethnocentrism and so on. So both of these traditions are very dominant within the writing of archaeological history. And of course, in particular, we are constantly reminded that imperialism and colonialism are the elephant in the room. I hope you like that joke. Because on the one hand, we are very much aware of long-term imperial histories, but we don't actually recognize the impact imperialism and colonialism had on our practices today. And of course, in particular, of course, we have to start thinking more closely about the definitions and the terms we use, because people use terms like imperialism, colonialism, and nationalism in a wide range of meanings and senses. And to begin with, we need to have a very nuanced idea of what exactly an empire is and how exactly did empires work on the ground. And so, for example, in the 19th century, there was always a perception that the British were very laissez-faire in terms of their cultural policy towards archaeology and culture, and that had a determinant effect on how archaeological projects were sponsored, and we have a lot of evidence for this in Cyprus. We also have people like Lucia Gunning who've discussed the role of the British Consular Service in the Mediterranean, not just the Aegean, in the collection of antiquities for the British Museum. So the two pictures slightly contradict each other there, because of course we can see from the activities of people like Charles Newton, he was very good at deploying the British Consular Service in the collection of antiquities for the British Museum. But we also have to remember alternative approaches to collection and excavation within imperial spaces. And the work here of Maya Jasanoff is very important, because she has reminded us of how a lot of archaeological initiative was taken by individuals, often of relatively low status, who carried out a whole range of antiquarian activities for their own benefit, rather than any higher political or imperial purpose. And finally, it's important to actually ask ourselves, what exactly do we mean by empire? Cyprus was part of the British Empire between 1878 and 1960 in what I might call practical terms, but it began as a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire, becomes a crown colony, and especially in the first part of that period, down to 1914, many aspects of British Cyprus were relics from the former Ottoman period, in particular the nuts and bolts of the population and the economy. And finally, we also have to realize that there have been critics of the idea that empire and colonialism were everywhere. Bernard Porter's somewhat controversial absent-minded imperialists question the nature of imperialism. He rightly, I think, points to economic power and also the power of individuals and institutions, as well as actual imperial governments. And finally, John Darwin has reminded us that the global expansion of Britain extended far beyond the territories that Britain formerly actually ruled. It also included economic and cultural power, soft power, and what you nowadays might be called neo-globalism. So I want to argue that the real elephant in the room here of our history of archaeology is not empires and big states. It's actually many of the constituent elements without which we could not have had significant archaeological discoveries. Robert just mentioned PMR's lack of interest in the local population, but of course we've increasingly realized how important local agency was in the uncovering of the archaeological past. And in this respect, I'm very interested in the work of Zeynep Çelik, who has written a fascinating survey of archaeology and politics in the Ottoman Empire. And the quote on the screen goes, "A chapter that has been conspicuously absent from histories of archaeology is the landscape of labour. Archaeological work always depended on a large labour force drawn from local populations that could seasonally reach hundreds of workers every day." And she also goes on to say that this intimate relationship between archaeologists and field workers does not emerge in either the contemporary accounts or in later scholarships. I would disagree slightly to say that it does not emerge in contemporaneous accounts, because if you actually look at old publications and especially at archives, you actually see a lot more engagement with local populations than is the case in more recent archaeological narratives. And she also goes on to discuss the importance of the work of Stephen Quirk, who wrote a fascinating account of Flinders Petrie's workers in Egypt, which were based on his meticulous diaries and notebooks that give us insights into the organisation of an archaeological site that is very difficult to obtain from other sources. So I want to begin with a number of ways of thinking about local agency and the archaeological workforces. This is a lovely example of an archival find. I discovered this in a box in the Department of Greece and Rome at the British Museum a few weeks ago. Now, I actually also discovered it about 10 years ago and completely forgot about it. But it's just a good example of how we can very easily overlook the material that's under our nose. This is a photograph taken by J.P. Foscolo, Limassol, the famous photographer, of a group of workers. I assume it's in Cyprus because of the Limassol connection, but there is absolutely no indication where exactly the photograph derives from. But as you can see, it consists of a large group of almost entirely men in traditional late Ottoman and perhaps early British clothing from the island. And an image like this is absolutely fascinating because, as you can see from the image on the left, this is a proper high quality photographic print, mounted expensively. This is not just some sort of casual snap. Somebody took this photograph for a reason, and I don't actually know why. It looks like it's in some sort of trench, but it's not clear if this is archaeological or some engineering project. So if anybody does recognize this picture, maybe from Cyprus, I'd love to know. Photography is a hugely important aspect of this story because photographs offer unique and very often unmediated images of what is going on at this time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this photograph showing the removal of the bull's head capital from the Agora of Salamis, discovered in 1890 by the Royal Navy in February of 1891. And of course, it's very commonly read as an example of imperial archaeology in action, because we have members of the Royal Navy ship Melita accompanied by about 40 local workers pulling this extraordinary object through the streets of Famagusta. And other images in the same archive in the British Museum could reinforce this sense that this is an imperial act par excellence. And the image on the right is particularly extraordinary. And you see the object being lowered into the hull of the Melita. But of course, it's very easy when looking for imperial meanings in photographs like this to actually miss out the most important elements, which are the local population. So here we have, for example, 40 of the workers who were hired to pull this object across the fields from Salamis to Famagusta. We have various members of the local elites. We have a policeman. We have so the policeman, we have an Orthodox priest, we have somebody who might be a Muslim imam or maybe a local official, and then we have two women as well, and the woman in the top left wrapped in an extraordinary karshaf, which looks like it's made out of clay. Now, very difficult to know what to read of that, because normally a Turkish Muslim woman in Cyprus would wear a white karshaf, and this is some extraordinary variant on that, but it's not quite clear. But what is very important to remember is that all of these British excavations that took place on the island in the 1880s and 1890s did so through the agency of the local population. The Bull's Head capital came from Salamis, as I've said, and it's very important to remember that the success of the Cyprus Exploration Fund work at Salamis in 1890 was due to the employment of something like 180 to 200 men, women and children who were employed to carry out this work. And the picture on the left is particularly fascinating because it shows the vast quantities of sand that had to be removed in order to discover the remains of the ancient city. And what's important too here is that until this time, Salamis was regarded as a hideous chaos of stone. It was encumbered by sand, by rubble, and so on from antiquity. And the Cyprus Exploration Fund created a coherent map of the city for the first time, but it was largely due to the agency of the people you can see here. These photographs and this one were taken by James Arthur Monroe, who was a member of the Cyprus Exploration Fund and one of the co-directors of Salamis. He also took a lot of what we might call ethnographic shots. These are photographs in the Ashmolean Museum archive in Oxford. And they're really only in the beginning of being studied, and they will deserve full publication in future. But what we should also remember is that some of these archaeologists at least took trouble to record local life as well as the archaeological sites themselves. And it's possible that they were invited to weddings and other festivities in the villages that they were working in. I wanted just for a moment to think about the kind of socio and economic terms of excavating in Cyprus as well, because the organization of a large excavation would have had a significant economic impact on villagers. How much were people actually paid? We know from various sources that men were paid between 7p and 1 shilling a day. Women might get about 7p a day, and children between 3 and 5.5p a day. Gender inequality existing then as now. But this is a Cyprus Exploration Fund excavations where up to 230 people were working. But we also have to put the cost of labour into the cost of other elements. If you wanted to hire a mule to travel around the island, it would cost between 8p and 1 shilling a day. But if you wanted more hardcore transport, you would pay 3 and 6 for a hire a camel and 6 shillings a day to hire a large oxen cart. And these were very, very useful for transporting archaeological finds. And one thing I argue in a paper I'm preparing at the moment is the extent to which these financial elements massively dictated the quality and the retention of archaeological excavations. In many cases, it was the economic situation because the government did not support cultural and excavation activity. A lot of the faults of these early excavations was due to lack of money. And on the other extreme, we need to look at the economic aspects of the visitors to the island, the archaeologists from London and other places. The transport costs were also extremely significant. If you wanted to get even from Larnaca to Limassol on a local ship, it could cost between 5 and 10 shillings. If you wanted to get to London or Liverpool, we're talking about 15 to 16 pounds. And so if you compare 1 shilling a day for a male worker with 15 to 16 pounds for a boat ride to London, we can just see the enormous differences between the visiting archaeologists and the local population. Now, I want to end with a very quick case study of one very important figure that we absolutely must think about in terms of archaeological activity, Gregory Antonio. And he encapsulates many of the complexities of talking about local agency. Antonio began his archaeological career as a casual excavator, possibly as early as the 1870s and early 80s. Max Richter tells us that he trained him as a foreman, and then Gregory goes on to become the foreman of all of the major British excavations, the CEF and the BM from 1888 to 1899. He also explores the island with archaeologists such as David Hogarth. By 1900, he is actually running Arthur Evans excavations at Knossos, and then he goes on to work as foreman at other British digs in Greece and Turkey. And at the age of around 60, he went and trained Leonard Woolley's legendary foreman Hamoudi Bey at the excavations at Carchemish. And he's a fascinating character because throughout his time working within British circles in the 1880s and 1890s, he is carrying out something of a private practice, excavating antiquities for sale. And this is the letter. This is the letter describing the discovery of the Bronze Age tomb near Semathis Menos in 1898. That was later sold to the British Museum. What's also interesting too is that we have archival traces of his activities from Antonio himself. On the left is a letter written in 1898 reporting on various archaeological aspects. What's interesting is that on the letter in the left, of course, written in Greek, but on the right is a letter written in English, but it's not an official translation. It's written in rather poor English. So it's possible that Antonio translated the letter himself. And it also has some lovely touches where he and his wife and his children send their best wishes to Mrs. Murray and Mrs. Walters. So it's very nice to see characters like him writing affectionate and friendly letters to his superiors in the British Museum as well. Now, another important element too is that Antonio was responsible for the excavation of perhaps thousands of objects in the British Museum. When I started working at the British Museum 15 years ago, there wasn't a single mention of his name in the database. And then I discovered that he was responsible for the first batch of artifacts from Clavdia Tremithos, which were discovered during looting, and that led to the formal excavation of the site in 1899. But of course, because Antonio supervised all of the major British excavations, the question is whether he should be attributed as excavator to all of these major sites. At the moment, it's mainly the curators who worked at the British Museum who are attributed with this information. And so he occupies a really important role in the archaeology, not just of Cyprus, but also of Greece, of Carchemish. And what's interesting here, I wanted, if you look at the quotation at the end of the page from Yannis Kalinakis, also described as a superman among foremen, Antonio exemplifies how a tomb hunter could potentially turn, with the development of archaeology, into one of the first skilled archaeological workers who, with their expertise, have since contributed immensely to the discovery of the past. And finally, here's another example of two local Cypriots who played a considerable role in excavations. On the left, we have a document written by Stafford Sabrina, who was the government inspector at Enkami, and this is his document outlining the government share of fines. And if you look at that, it's an administrative document, but also it's an archaeological document because it provides information about the finds. It's like an early form of tomb inventory. And then on the right, we have the report by Theodorides, who excavated at Kuklia in 1899, and he was also the government inspector. So to conclude, we have to remember that uncovering the histories of Cypriot archaeology can be difficult, but there is an awful lot of raw material there. Archives in particular are fascinating. And as Paulina Nicolaou has said, archives, either held in museums, libraries or universities, are material sites for the excavation of a diverse range of histories. Thank you.